Greetings there, academic proletariat, and welcome to this episode of the Fireside Chats with Mr. Olson, where we will be discussing crises in colonial America. Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. There's no guided notes for this one, so you're just going to be on your own. You can always ask for the slide notes if you want them, but here we go. Okay, so for our colonial discussion has developed like this so far. England colonized much of North America in addition to the French and the Spanish, but for the most part we're concerned with England here. They developed New England and the Chesapeake initially, and when those two places developed, they developed quite differently. They took on unique characteristics, and those characteristics led to rigid development in certain ways. So the Chesapeake had a plantation economy, whereas religion dominated in New England, and that rigid development then manifested itself in various crises, which will be the discussion of this video. So we're going to go ahead and start with probably the more interesting but the less important of the two, and that would be the Salem witchcraft trials. So many of us have heard about the Salem witchcraft trials because your third grade teacher thought they were cool, and so you talked about them a lot. You might have even seen this map. But the first thing to know about Salem in 1692 is the fact that there's a disconnect between the people who live in Salem Village and the people who live in Salem Town. So Salem Town is where Salem, Massachusetts actually is today. Salem Village was a more rural sort of offshoot of Salem Town. But what you can assume during the colonial era is that the people who lived in Salem Town generally tended to be more affluent because it was right on the water. It was where more of the merchants lived. But then you also had people who were more poor. So you had the beggars, you had the homeless people like that. Salem Village was a more steady economic area. It was people who lived on self-sufficient farms. But if you notice, the people who lived closer to the town were those that were accused. The people who lived out in the village were those who were the accusers. So that might tell us something a little bit later. But the people who lived in the town were mostly being accused. The people who lived in the more rural area were doing the accusing. Okay, so why is Salem being punished? Before we discuss that, let's discuss what happened. So there was a slave of the Reverend Samuel Perce, and the slave's name was Tituba. Samuel Perce was the reverend in the area. He used to be a planter in Barbados, so he brought a slave home with him. And Tituba gets accused by two girls in the area one of the girls is the daughter of the Reverend Samuel Perce. She gets accused of doing witchcraft and putting spells on the girls, and the girls sort of have these fits. They walk around on all fours barking like a dog, and they have these convulsions and things that can't really be explained by science at the time. So it sort of throws everybody into a frenzy. Anyways, Tituba could have made this really easy by denying it, but she confesses, and that throws everybody into a craze. And when she confesses, she says that two other people, Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne, sorry if your name is Sarah, you're kind of thrown under the bus for this one, and both of whom were sort of precarious members of society. She says that they had ridden around on brooms together and they saw a man in a black cape who told them to sign his book. And so they did. So Tituba kind of outs them. Now, you might wonder why she outs them. Well, if you out somebody, then you get to stay alive. If you deny it, then you get accused of being a witch for sure, and you get killed. So you kind of caught in a really weird position. Anyways, we'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. Anyways, at the end of the whole deal, 20 people were executed, not all of them female. There were a couple of dudes who got it too. And the one big issue that's sort of accentuated by this whole Salem witchcraft trial process is the fact that the court that heard the cases, it was called the Court of Oyer and Terminer, allowed a certain kind of evidence called spectral evidence. Spectral evidence is something that can't be proven. So it'd be something in the way of like a dream or a daydream or thoughts, something that can't be seen, something more abstract. Anyways, it led many to question colonial New England's justice system, rightly so, but only after the people had been executed. It also contributes to our modern day legal tenet of innocent until proven guilty, because the people who were accused of witchcraft were guilty until proven innocent, and as I said before, it was really hard to prove your innocence, because if you tried to be innocent, well, then you were a witch. Okay, so there's a list of the people who were killed. If you want to pause me, you can and take a look at it. One thing that I want to point out to you is all of them were hanged. None of them were burnt to the stake, contrary to Monty Python and the Holy Grail. But you'll notice that Giles Corey was pressed to death, and that's because he refused to say anything. He didn't want to admit to being a witch because then he would have all of his possessions or he didn't want to admit to being a witch because he wasn't, and he didn't want to say he was. He didn't want to deny being a witch because then he would have got tried and convicted anyways, and all of his possessions would have been taken from him by the state. So he just didn't say anything, and he got pressed to death, which means that the people of Salem just put stones on top of him until he died, like flattened him. Pretty gross. But anyways, the accusers, as I mentioned before, Betty Perce, who was the daughter of the Reverend, and Abigail Williams, who was her cousin, they're seen here in the picture, sort of having their fits. And then some of the accusers, Bridget Bishop, a 60-year-old tavern owner, and it was weird for women to own a tavern, so that's what made her kind of unique. She was also a town gossip. Susanna Martin, who stood to inherit a lot of money from her father, says should say from her father. Rebecca Nurse, the matriarch of a large family, so it was usually normal to have a patriarch, not a matriarch. And then finally, Dorcas Good, who was the daughter of Sarah Good, one of the initial accused, and I bring her up because she was only 4 years old, so young in fact that they had to make special handcuffs for her. Sad, sad day. All right, so now let's talk about why it happened. What were the causes of this witchcraft craze? And it's kind of hard to prove it, but we can speculate, so let's do it. First thing is divine punishment to Salem. Salem's being punished by God and or the devil for various things. Could be the halfway covenant in that they sort of laxed on their religious requirements. Could be the fact that less people were going to church. Could be the fact that Satan had just shown up. It was something divine, which is hard to prove, but if you're, that's sort of what the Salem people thought, so it's clear. Social or economic inequalities that we alluded to before. There was this disconnect between the town and the village, and so poor people, rich people, the poor people want to try and get more of a say, so they implicate the rich people, not usually the direction that it goes, but that's the direction it was going in Salem. There's also this idea that there was ergot poisoning. Ergot is a fungus that attacks rye plants, and it brings on similar symptoms of what the girls were expressing. Some people find this hard to believe, though, because ergot poisoning is something that stays on for a long time, and the scientists don't necessarily believe it, but it's out there. It's a suggestion. There's also an idea that there was cold weather or a mini ice age, and witchcraft crazes, which had been happening in Europe, apparently coincided with cold weather and mini ice ages before. Mini ice ages cause bad harvests, which also tend to coincide with witchcraft crazes. Anyways, any of these things can be taken into account. I'm not going to point in the direction of anyone, but I will say that one of them at least stands out to me as being the most likely. But like I said, I'm not going to indoctrinate you in any way. All right. So, what do the trials tell us about colonial Massachusetts and colonial New England? Well, first of all, it was not harmonious. There wasn't as much peace there as we think. The standard American line of, the colonies were great and they show this rugged individualism, not necessarily the case. I wouldn't have wanted to be around during the witchcraft trials. They were crazy. It also shows that there were class differences between the residents. All the people were not rich. All the people were not poor. But there was some rich people, some poor people. All the people were not middle class, if that makes sense. All right, religion was also causing cleavages between the residents. That means it was driving wedges instead of bringing the people together. We like to think of colonial New England, this city on a hill, as being a savior, when in fact it was kind of getting in the way. And then finally, the legal system was seriously inept, which we discussed before. Okay. Now, let's move to Colonial Virginia, where we will talk about Bacon's Rebellion. Now, just a reminder, colonial Massachusetts is in the New England colonies. New England tended to have small, self-sufficient subsistence farmers, whereas in Virginia, there were large plantations that had houses like this. Important to remember, large plantations that were facilitated at this time by tobacco. They grew tobacco in Virginia. Okay, sorry, just had to be clear on that one. Anyways, it's important to keep note between these two terms, the Tidewater and the backcountry. So the Tidewater Gentry were people who lived along the water near the coast where the land was more fertile. The backcountry or the frontiersmen lived more inland on land that was less arable, less desirable. Okay, so there's going to be a clash, and here's who the clash involves. It includes this fancy pants, Nathaniel Bacon, who represents former indentured servants. Now, I want you to look at him. Does he really look like someone who represents indentured servants? he looks very fancy. He looks almost like Shakespeare, if you will. Anyways, he's going up against this guy, Governor William Berkeley, who is the colonial government executive, if you will. Anyways, they both look like they're wealthy, and they both are. So I don't want you to think that this is entirely from top to bottom a fight between rich people and poor people. However, it will sort of morph into one as we go. Okay, so let's start by just giving you a way to remember it. This is Bacon's Rebellion. So what better way to remember it as Bacon and the indentured servants as Bacon versus Governor Berkeley and eggs? I don't know how you're going to remember that, but anyways, there's a try. Okay, so let's talk about the farmers first. So the farmers were former indentured servants, and they lived inland, so they lived in that back country. They lived on land that was worse than that of the Tidewater Gentry. They also lived closer to the Indians, so the Indians kept attacking them. They didn't want to get attacked by the Indians because it got in the way of their tobacco plantation, so they asked the House of Burgesses to help fight off the Indians. Well, since the farmers, the indentured servants, didn't get a lot of votes in the House of Burgesses, it didn't really go anywhere. So the governor did not support attacking the Indians for reasons that we'll talk about in a second. Anyways, the indentured servants didn't like the fact that the governor had a close relationship with the Indians. The governor liked to trade fur and things with the Indians, and why not? He made money off of it. So anyways, Bacon becomes this sort of de facto leader of the indentured servants, and he issues a list of demands to Governor Berkeley and the House of Burgesses, which you can imagine was denied. Okay, so now let's talk about the perspective of Governor Berkeley and the Tidewater Gentry. They wanted protection from falling tobacco prices. Every time an indentured servant got its freedom, they went and got land, they started growing tobacco, which increased the supply of tobacco, which decreased the price. So Governor Berkeley and his Tidewater Gentry didn't like the indentured servants. They weren't about to help them. They didn't want to pay for an Indian war, and they didn't want to disrupt the aforementioned fur trade. So for all those reasons, the Tidewater Gentry and Governor Berkeley did not want to help Bacon and his indentured servants. So what does Bacon do? What any normal person would do. He marches on Jamestown and burns it down. Okay, so just to review, Bacon's Rebellion involves former indentured servants. They're not accepted in Jamestown. They're disenfranchised and unable to receive their land often. When they do receive their land, they don't have as good of land, therefore they can't make as much money, and they're getting attacked by Indians. Governor Berkeley won't help them. And then finally, they rise up in rebellion against the House of Burgesses and Governor Berkeley. Now, interesting thing that they do is they co-opt some of the African slaves to help join them against the House of Burgesses and the colonial government because they're offering slaves freedom, but they want that manpower. So slaves that help fight in Bacon's rebellion get their freedom, which is ironic. You'll see why in a second. So anyways, Nathaniel Bacon acts as the representative for the rebels. Governor Berkeley refused to meet their demands, so Bacon marches on Jamestown and burns it down. Then, very quickly and sadly, right after he burns down Jamestown, Bacon gets dysentery, which is a fancy word for diarrhea, and dies. And once he dies, the rebellion sort of fizzles out, the rebels are hung, Governor Berkeley comes back, and everything is hunky-dory, except, of course, if you are an African slave or somebody of African descent in Virginia, because this really shows the Tidewater Gentry that relying on former indentured servants for labor, relying on indentured servants for labor is not a good idea. Because they get their freedom and because they get their land and because they then become competition, bad news. So the big consequence of Bacon's Rebellion is the fact that plantation owners start to see African slaves as a better alternative to indentured servants for labor. So the importation of African slaves, which had been already going on for roughly 60 years, is now going to increase tremendously. No more indentured servants, African slavery it is. So, consequences. The planners realized that if indentured servants and African slaves are able to co-opt their power and unite again, it would spell bad news for the planters. So they want to try and stem that at all possible. So here's what they do. They make peace with the indentured servants by promising to go after the Native Americans when the Native Americans are attacking in the backcountry. But then they really put in this propaganda campaign of focusing the farmers' hatred on African slaves that were competing with them for jobs rather than on the Tidewater Gentry. So the Tidewater Gentry turns this from a class issue into a racial one, convincing the poor former indentured servants that they should turn their hatred towards African slaves who might become their competition in the future. So instead of competing with the rich gentry on the coast, the indentured servants start to compete with the African slaves, which is a legacy that will be carried on, well, until now. Anyways, that's the end. You have died of dysentery. I bid you all adieu. Peace.